I was trying to explain my symptoms to the doctor, but my husband cut me off mid-sentence. "Doctor, don't listen to her. She's being dramatic and exaggerating everything. Let me tell you what's really wrong with her." The doctor didn't even let me finish what I was saying. This happened 3 weeks ago during what was supposed to be my medical appointment, and I'm still shaking with anger about it. I've been married for 18 years, and somewhere along the way, my husband decided he's my official spokesperson. Not in a sweet, protective way, in a way that makes me feel like I'm a child who can't be trusted to speak for herself. The medical appointment was the breaking point, but it's been building up for years. Every important conversation, every interaction with authority figures, every situation where I need to advocate for myself, he jumps in like I'm incapable of forming coherent sentences. I work with kids all day and manage classroom situations that would make grown adults cry. I handle parent conferences, deal with difficult administrators, and navigate complex educational policies. But according to my husband, I can't explain a headache to a doctor without his interpretation. The worst part wasn't even that he interrupted me. It was watching the doctor's face shift. One moment, the doctor was listening to me with professional attention. The next, after my husband's comment about me being dramatic, I could see the dismissal creep across his features. Suddenly, I wasn't a patient describing concerning symptoms, I was the hysterical wife whose husband needed to provide the real story. My husband proceeded to describe my symptoms completely wrong. He minimized the severity of my headaches, forgot to mention the vision changes I'd been experiencing, and somehow turned my concern about potential neurological issues into me being overly anxious about normal stress headaches. The doctor nodded along, took notes based on my husband's version, and prescribed basic pain medication that I'd already tried. I sat there feeling invisible in my own medical appointment. When I tried to interject with corrections, my husband would give me this look, like I was proving his point about being dramatic, and the doctor would barely acknowledge what I was saying. I left that appointment with inadequate treatment because my own husband had convinced a medical professional that I couldn't accurately describe my own body's experience. This pattern shows up everywhere in our lives, and I'm starting to realize how much damage it's doing. Last month, we were at the bank trying to resolve an issue with our joint account. I had done all the research, gathered the documentation, and understood exactly what needed to be fixed. But the moment we sat down with the representative, my husband took over. He got half the details wrong, missed the crucial timeline that was causing the problem, and somehow made it sound like we were asking for special treatment instead of correcting a bank error. The representative started looking at me like I was the demanding wife pushing my husband to make unreasonable requests. I tried to clarify, but my husband kept talking over me, and eventually, the bank representative was only addressing him. We left without resolving the issue, and I had to make another appointment, alone, to actually fix the problem. But even that felt like a betrayal of my marriage somehow. Why did I have to sneak around to handle my own financial business? The pattern is always the same. In any situation that matters, medical appointments, financial discussions, school meetings about our kids, even conversations with contractors working on our house. He positions himself as the reliable narrator and me as the unreliable witness to my own life. Our parent-teacher conferences are particularly humiliating. I'm an educator myself, so I understand the dynamics, the educational jargon, and what questions to ask. But my husband dominates these conversations, often getting facts about our children's academic progress completely wrong. He'll confidently state things about their homework habits or classroom behavior that are the opposite of what I observe at home. The teachers clearly don't know who to believe when my husband and I provide conflicting information about our own children. They end up looking uncomfortable and confused, and I can see them making mental notes about our family dynamics that probably aren't favorable. Last year, our youngest was struggling with reading comprehension, and I had spent weeks researching intervention strategies and observing patterns in her homework challenges. I went to the conference prepared with specific examples and questions about additional support. But my husband immediately launched into his theory that she was just being lazy and needed more discipline at home. He spoke over my attempts to share the detailed observations I'd made, dismissed my research as overcomplicating things, and essentially told the teacher that I was coddling our daughter instead of pushing her appropriately. The teacher spent the entire conference trying to navigate between my husband's insistence on a punishment-based approach and my attempts to discuss evidence-based reading interventions. Our daughter didn't get the help she needed until I scheduled a separate meeting with the teacher, apologized for the confusion, and provided the documentation I'd never gotten to share in the original conference. Even then, I felt like I was going behind my husband's back and undermining our marriage. This dynamic has started affecting how other people see me, and it's changing how I see myself. Friends and family have begun directing questions to my husband that they used to ask me directly. When we're in social situations and someone brings up a topic I'm knowledgeable about, I can see them glance at my husband expectantly, as if my opinion needs his approval or translation. I noticed it first at neighborhood gatherings. I used to be the one people came to with questions about school policies, classroom strategies, or child development issues because of my background in education. Now, even when the conversation starts with someone asking me directly, my husband inevitably jumps in with his own interpretation of whatever I'm saying. He doesn't just add to the conversation, he corrects me, contradicts me, or rephrases what I've said as if I hadn't explained it clearly enough. People have started asking him follow-up questions instead of me, and I watch conversations about my own area of expertise happen around me instead of with me. The isolation is becoming unbearable. I feel like I'm disappearing in my own life, becoming a supporting character in conversations where I should be the main participant. My husband has somehow convinced not just strangers, but people who have known me for years that he is the more reliable source of information about everything, including my own thoughts and experiences. Update 1. The responses to my original post were eye-opening, but I wasn't prepared for what happened when I decided to address this issue directly with my husband. I chose a quiet evening when the kids were doing homework upstairs, thinking we could have a calm, private conversation about how his interrupting was affecting me. I started by explaining how I felt dismissed and unheard, using specific examples from recent situations. I tried to keep my tone non-accusatory, focusing on how his behavior made me feel rather than attacking his intentions. I thought if I could just help him understand the impact, he would want to change. His response floored me. He didn't deny the interrupting, he defended it. According to him, I take too long to get to the point, provide too much unnecessary detail, and often miss the most important information. He said he was helping by making our conversations more efficient and ensuring that other people got the information they actually needed. When I brought up the medical appointment specifically, he said he was protecting me from my own tendency to overthink symptoms and worry doctors unnecessarily. He claimed that if he hadn't stepped in, I would have wasted the doctor's time with anxiety-driven complaints instead of focusing on the real issues. The conversation that was supposed to fix our communication problem turned into him explaining why my communication was the problem. Every example I gave of feeling dismissed, he reframed as evidence that I needed his help to communicate effectively. By the end of the night, I was questioning whether I really was as unclear and scattered as he claimed. But then something happened that made me realize how deep this problem goes. Our teenage son came downstairs while we were talking and asked me a question about his history project. Before I could answer, my husband jumped in with information that was completely wrong, confidently wrong. I corrected him gently, and our son looked back and forth between us, clearly unsure who to believe. My husband then explained to our son that I was overthinking the assignment and making it more complicated than necessary. Our son nodded and thanked his father, ignoring my attempts to provide the accurate information. Watching my husband undermine my credibility with our own child, and seeing our son dismiss my knowledge in favor of his father's incorrect but confident response, was devastating. I realized that this pattern wasn't just affecting my interactions with strangers, it was teaching our children that my voice didn't matter in our own family. The next morning I drove to the library and spent hours researching the historical topic our son was working on. I printed out sources, made notes, and prepared a clear, detailed explanation. When I got home, I found our son struggling with his project because the information his father had given him was indeed wrong. I helped him find the correct information and complete his assignment properly. But when my husband got home and saw the finished project, he praised our son for figuring out the complex historical timeline and didn't acknowledge that the information he provided had been incorrect. This incident made me start paying attention to how often my husband's confident interruptions were actually wrong. I began keeping a private record, and the results were disturbing. In medical situations, he frequently misrepresented my symptoms or medical history. In school-related discussions, he often provided outdated or incorrect information about educational policies. In financial conversations, he sometimes confused details that led to complications later. But his confidence never wavered, and his willingness to interrupt me never decreased, even when his information was provably wrong. People continued to defer to him because confidence is often mistaken for competence, especially when it comes from a man correcting a woman. I started feeling like I was living in an alternate reality where facts mattered less than presentation, where being loud and confident was more valuable than being accurate and thoughtful. The gaslighting aspect became clear when I realized that my husband genuinely believed his versions of events, even when they contradicted documented facts. 2 weeks after our initial conversation, I tried addressing the issue again, this time with specific examples of situations where his interruptions had led to problems. I brought documentation, the bank paperwork that showed the issue I'd originally tried to explain, medical records that supported the symptoms he'd dismissed, our son's assignment that demonstrated the incorrect information he provided. Instead of acknowledging the pattern, he accused me of keeping score and trying to make him look bad. He said my obsession with being right was damaging our marriage and that I was prioritizing being heard over being helpful. The conversation ended with him storming out, and me sitting alone with a pile of evidence that apparently didn't matter. Update 2. 3 months have passed since my last update, and I need to share what's been happening because the situation has escalated in ways I never expected. The documentation I mentioned keeping became crucial in ways I hadn't anticipated. After my second conversation with my husband went nowhere, I decided to focus on protecting myself in situations where accuracy mattered most. I started attending medical appointments alone, handling our banking privately, and meeting with our children's teachers separately. I told myself this was a temporary solution while I figured out how to fix our communication issues. My husband's reaction to these changes was swift and intense. He accused me of excluding him from important decisions, going behind his back, and damaging our partnership. According to him, I was being secretive and undermining our marriage by handling things independently. But something interesting happened when I started managing these interactions alone. Problems got resolved efficiently. My medical concerns were taken seriously, and I received appropriate treatment for the neurological issues that had been dismissed when my husband spoke for me. The bank sorted out our account problems quickly when I could present the information clearly without interruption. Teachers could provide targeted support for our children when they received accurate information about what was happening at home. For the first time in years, I felt competent and heard in these important interactions. I remembered what it was like to be taken seriously as an adult capable of managing my own affairs. The contrast was stark and liberating. However, this independence came with unexpected social consequences. My husband began telling people that I was having some kind of breakdown, that I was being secretive and paranoid, and that he was worried about my mental state. He framed my desire to handle my own medical and financial business as evidence that I was becoming unstable. This narrative gained traction quickly among some of our social circle. People who had watched my husband interrupt and correct me for years suddenly saw my independence as concerning rather than healthy. The same friends who had deferred to my husband's version of events now whispered about whether I was having a midlife crisis or struggling with some kind of mental health issue. The turning point came during a neighborhood barbecue 6 weeks ago. I was having a conversation with another parent about curriculum changes at our kids' school, a topic I'm genuinely knowledgeable about due to my work in education. As usual, my husband joined the conversation and began correcting information I was sharing, despite having no background in educational policy. But this time I didn't back down. I continued sharing accurate information and politely corrected him when he stated things that were factually wrong. The other parent seemed confused by the contradiction, looking back and forth between us like they were watching a tennis match. My husband's response was to announce loudly that I'd been acting strange lately, that I was being confrontational and argumentative in ways that weren't like me. He suggested to the other parent that they might want to verify educational information through official school channels rather than relying on my current state of mind. Standing there, watching my husband publicly question my mental stability because I had refused to let him spread misinformation about my area of expertise, was a moment of absolute clarity. This wasn't about communication styles or efficiency. This was about control, credibility, and the systematic undermining of my voice and authority. Several people at the barbecue overheard this exchange, and I could see them processing what they'd witnessed. Some looked uncomfortable with how my husband had handled the situation. Others seemed to accept his narrative that I was the problem. The division was stark and telling. In the weeks following the barbecue incident, I started receiving mixed reactions from our social circle. Some friends reached out privately to check on me, having recognized something unhealthy in the dynamic they'd witnessed. Others began treating me with the cautious politeness reserved for people who might be unstable. The most painful part was realizing how long this pattern had been affecting my reputation and relationships. Friends admitted they'd been confused for years about why I seemed so different in group settings compared to one-on-one conversations. They'd noticed that I became quiet and deferential when my husband was present, but they'd attributed it to relationship dynamics rather than recognizing it as a sign of something problematic. One friend told me she'd started asking my husband questions about topics she knew I was knowledgeable about because she'd learned that he would answer anyway, and it seemed easier than watching him interrupt and correct me. Another mentioned that she'd stopped inviting me to certain social events because my husband dominated conversations and made the dynamics uncomfortable for everyone. Learning that my husband's behavior had been affecting not just my own social interactions, but other people's comfort in my inclusion in social activities was devastating. I realized that I'd been gradually isolated not just from my own voice, but from friendships and community connections. Final update. I'm writing this final update from my own apartment where I've been living for the past month. The decision to separate wasn't planned, but became inevitable after a series of events that made staying impossible. The catalyst was our youngest daughter's parent-teacher conference 2 months ago. Despite my attempts to handle school meetings independently, my husband insisted on attending this one because our daughter was struggling academically. I agreed, hoping we could present a united front in getting her the support she needed. The meeting started well with the teacher explaining our daughter's challenges with reading comprehension and suggesting some intervention strategies. I had done extensive research and was prepared to discuss specific approaches that might help. But when I began sharing what I'd learned about evidence-based reading interventions, my husband interrupted to say that I was overcomplicating things and that our daughter just needed more discipline at home. What happened next changed everything. Our daughter's teacher, a young woman probably in her first few years of teaching, looked directly at my husband and said something that cut through all the noise. Actually, I'd like to hear what Mom has to say. She clearly has educational background, and her insights about her daughter's learning patterns at home are exactly what I need to develop an effective support plan. My husband's face went red. He started to interrupt again, but the teacher held up her hand and said, "I'm going to need both parents to take turns speaking so I can get complete information." She then turned to me and asked me to continue with what I'd been saying. For the next 30 minutes, I was able to share my observations, research, and suggestions without interruption. The teacher asked thoughtful follow-up questions, took detailed notes, and developed a comprehensive plan to support our daughter. My husband sat silent, clearly furious at being managed by someone he probably saw as a young woman who didn't know her place. After the meeting, my husband was quiet until we got to the car. Then he exploded. He accused me of embarrassing him, undermining his authority as a father, and conspiring with the teacher to make him look incompetent. He said I had clearly discussed him negatively with the teacher beforehand to make her take my side. The drive home was filled with him detailing every way I had humiliated him in that meeting, how I had shown disrespect for our marriage by not deferring to his input, and how my behavior was becoming increasingly erratic and concerning. By the time we reached our house, he had convinced himself that I was having some kind of breakdown and that he needed to take steps to protect our family from my instability. That night, I lay awake thinking about what had happened. A teacher half my age had managed to create space for my voice in one 30-minute meeting. She had recognized my expertise, valued my input, and treated me as an equal participant in my own child's education. The contrast with how I was treated in my own marriage was stark and undeniable. The final straw came the next week when I had a medical emergency. I had been experiencing severe headaches and vision changes for months, the same symptoms my husband had dismissed and misrepresented to the first doctor. When the symptoms suddenly worsened one evening, I knew I needed immediate medical attention. My husband drove me to the emergency room, and I assumed that in a crisis situation, he would let me speak for myself about serious symptoms. I was wrong. When the triage nurse asked about my symptoms, my husband immediately launched into his assessment that I was having anxiety-related headaches and probably didn't need emergency care. I tried to explain that my vision was affected and that I was experiencing neurological symptoms I'd never had before. My husband interrupted to tell the nurse that I was prone to health anxiety and that I often catastrophized minor symptoms. He suggested they might want to consider the psychological component of my complaints. The nurse looked uncomfortable but seemed to accept my husband's assessment. I was triaged as non-urgent and told to wait. We sat in the waiting room for 3 hours while my symptoms worsened. When I tried to approach the nurse's station to update them on my condition, my husband told me I was being impatient and dramatic. Finally, I had enough. I walked up to the nurse's station alone and clearly explained my symptoms, my medical history, and my concerns about potential neurological issues. I asked to speak with the doctor immediately. Within 20 minutes, I was taken back for evaluation. The doctor who examined me was alarmed by my symptoms and ordered immediate imaging. The CT scan revealed signs of increased intracranial pressure that required immediate treatment. What my husband had been dismissing as anxiety-related headaches were symptoms of a serious medical condition that could have had devastating consequences if left untreated. As I lay in the hospital bed receiving treatment, I realized that my husband's need to control my narrative had literally put my life at risk. His dismissal of my symptoms hadn't just been annoying or demeaning, it had been dangerous. If I hadn't finally advocated for myself, the delay in treatment could have caused permanent damage. When the doctor explained the seriousness of my condition to both of us, my husband's response was to ask if stress could have caused it, suggesting that my recent behavioral changes might have contributed to my health problems. Even faced with evidence that my symptoms had been real and serious, he was still trying to reframe the situation to make me the problem. That night in the hospital, I made the decision to leave. Not just the marriage, but the entire dynamic that had made me question my own reality for years. I realized that I had been living in a relationship where my thoughts, feelings, experiences, and even physical symptoms were subject to my husband's approval and interpretation. The separation has been difficult, but the relief has been profound. I'm remembering what it feels like to trust my own perceptions, to speak without anticipating interruption, and to be taken seriously by the people around me. My children are adjusting to the new living arrangements, and I'm working to repair any damage that years of watching their father dismiss their mother might have caused. My friends have been divided in their responses, which has been painful but not surprising. Some have been incredibly supportive, sharing that they'd recognized the unhealthy dynamic for years but hadn't known how to address it. Others seem to believe my husband's narrative that I'm having some kind of breakdown and that I'm breaking up our family over communication issues. What's interesting is how differently people treat me now that I'm on my own. In professional settings, social situations, and even casual interactions, I'm spoken to directly and treated as a competent adult. The contrast with how I was treated when my husband was present is striking and validating. I'm not sure what the future holds for our marriage. My husband is convinced that I'll come to my senses and realize that I'm overreacting to normal relationship dynamics. He seems genuinely baffled that I would leave a marriage over what he sees as minor communication issues. But I know now that this was never about communication. It was about respect, autonomy, and the right to be heard in my own life. I spent years doubting my own perceptions and accepting a reality where my voice didn't matter. I'm not willing to do that anymore. For anyone reading this who recognizes these patterns in their own relationship, I want to say this: your voice matters. Your thoughts and experiences are valid. You don't need someone else's permission or interpretation to trust your own reality. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself and your family is to refuse to accept a dynamic that diminishes who you are. I'm still figuring out what comes next, but I'm doing it with a clear head and a voice that's finally my own.